The room was dim, almost sepulchral. A single light bulb swayed above Tim Burton's head, casting restless shadows on the walls like ghosts of his own creation. At 66, his voice was softer, slower, stripped of the manic energy that once defined him. He looked into the camera, and after a long pause, said the words that froze the room. "He's not just my actor, he's my reflection." For decades, the world celebrated their alliance as one of Hollywood's most extraordinary artistic partnerships. Tim Burton and Johnny Depp, two names that had become inseparable, like ink and shadow, or dream and nightmare. Together, they had built entire worlds out of melancholy, a boy with scissors for hands, a barber who sang through murder, a sleepy town haunted by a headless ghost. Each film was a mirror. And in that mirror lived something unspoken, a connection that felt less like collaboration and more like confession. "He's my reflection." The phrase sounded like an admission, but also like a curse. It implied intimacy, dependence, and an unspoken darkness shared between two men who never quite belonged anywhere else. Behind the whimsical monsters and pale-faced heroes, there was something almost ritualistic about their bond. Burton could not imagine directing without Depp. Depp could not imagine being fully seen except through Burton's eyes. What began as artistic kinship evolved into something deeper, a creative symbiosis, so consuming that it blurred the line between muse and mirror, director and doppelganger. But when the lights dim and the cameras stop rolling, what remains of such devotion? When two men become each other's shadow, do they create art or do they build a cage? It's a question that now haunts the legacy of their friendship. Was it the purest form of artistic connection or an emotional dependency masked as genius? Because not every friendship is born from light. Some are forged in darkness, where two lonely souls find not salvation, but reflection. In the late 1980s, Hollywood was still ruled by symmetry, by smiles, polished for red carpets, and stories wrapped in happy endings. Then came Edward Scissorhands, 1990, a fable that looked like it had crawled out of someone's subconscious. It was grotesque and beautiful, alien and tender, and at the heart of it stood Johnny Depp, fragile, pale, and trembling as if he had been cut open straight from Tim Burton's imagination. For the audience, it was the beginning of a cinematic romance. For Tim Burton, it was a homecoming. Depp, then still remembered for his youthful rebellion in 21 Jump Street, had found in Burton something he didn't know he was looking for, a world that mirrored his discomfort with fame, his suspicion of normalcy, and his fascination with outsiders. Edward was me, Depp would later say. But he was also Tim. We were both that boy terrified of being touched. From that moment, something clicked. What followed was not merely a collaboration, it was an unspoken vow. Over the next 2 decades, they built a mythology of their own. A parallel Hollywood where the strange could be sacred and sadness could be beautiful. Their filmography became a litany of gothic hymns: Ed Wood, 1994, Sleepy Hollow, 1999, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, 2005, Corpse Bride, 2005, Sweeney Todd, 2007, Alice in Wonderland, 2010, and Dark Shadows, 2012. Each project seemed less like work and more like an incantation. Burton would draw sketches, thin figures, hollow eyes, messy hair, and Depp would interpret them with uncanny precision. "He doesn't need to tell me who they are," Depp once explained. "I just look at the drawings, and I know what they're feeling." It was as though Burton spoke in dreams, and Depp translated those dreams into motion. Between them existed a kind of telepathy that critics couldn't explain and others could only envy. On set, they barely exchanged words. A glance was enough. A gesture carried the entire meaning of a scene. Crew members called it the ritual. Journalists adored it. Magazines framed them as Hollywood's last true artist-muse duo. Two men united by imagination and estrangement. Their interviews were filled with affectionate humor, Burton's neurotic, shy energy countered by Depp's calm, almost protective silence. It looked effortless, destined, and for a long time, the illusion held. Audiences came to expect that every Burton project would include Depp, just as every Depp transformation powdered face, black eyeshadow, peculiar diction would carry Burton's fingerprint. It was a symbiosis that felt invincible. Each new release reaffirmed the myth, two kindred spirits creating a universe where misfits could be beautiful. But inside that illusion of perfection, something else was brewing, a quiet dependence that neither man wanted to name. Burton, despite his global fame, was never comfortable with Hollywood. He thrived in isolation, his sketches, his monsters, his cemetery humor were a way to make sense of loneliness. Depp, too, recoiled from celebrity. For him, acting had always been a form of disguise, a way to hide from the spotlight while pretending to stand in it. In each other, they found a mirror that didn't judge. Burton saw in Depp the human version of his creatures misunderstood. Tender, strange. Depp saw in Burton the father figure who spoke in metaphors instead of orders, who didn't demand performance but authenticity. Together, they built an emotional shelter made of art. The public saw masterpieces. They saw survival. Depp once joked that they were like two ghosts haunting the same house. And perhaps that was the truest description of all. They were not just collaborators, they were companions in exile, two men translating their alienation into cinema. Every time Burton filmed Depp, he was also filming himself. Every time Depp played a Burton character, he was performing a small confession, not of sin, but of sorrow. This was the illusion, not fame, not genius, but connection. The kind that feels so pure it blinds you to its cost. By the mid-2000s, the Burton Depp aesthetic had become iconic. White makeup, black eyeliner, tragic poetry hidden in absurd humor. It inspired fashion, music videos, and an entire generation of misfits who finally saw themselves reflected in cinema. But behind the curtain of creative brilliance, repetition began to echo. Critics started to whisper that the duo had become formulaic. Burton can't make a film without Depp, they said. What had once been magic was turning into habit. The illusion of perfection, of eternal artistic harmony, began to crack. There were moments, quiet ones, when Burton's interviews hinted at fatigue. "I draw these figures," he told Empire magazine, "and sometimes I realize they all look the same." It was a confession disguised as a joke. He was talking about his characters, but he might have been talking about himself and about Depp. Still, the bond held. Even when their personal lives began to spiral in opposite directions, they remained each other's constant. When Depp was vilified by tabloids, Burton kept silent but loyal. When Burton withdrew from public life, Depp defended him as the only director who ever made me feel seen. They didn't need words. They never did. It's easy, in hindsight, to romanticize that connection, to call it devotion, friendship, even love. But to those who look closer, it was something far more delicate, a lifelong dialogue between two souls trying to survive their own isolation for the world. They were geniuses for each other. They were mirrors. And perhaps that is the most dangerous illusion of all, when the person who saves you is also the one who reflects every darkness you're trying to escape. When Tim Burton said, "He's not just my actor, he's my reflection," it wasn't a compliment. It was a confession, the kind that hides more pain than pride. Because behind the eccentric charm, the creative telepathy, and the cinematic myth, there lived two men who were, in essence, frightened children, one who drew monsters to survive his loneliness, and one who became monsters to hide his wounds. Burton grew up in Burbank, California, a suburb that prided itself on sunshine and conformity. But he was a boy who found comfort in shadows. While others played baseball, he sketched graveyards. While neighbors painted fences, he filmed stop-motion skeletons in his backyard. He once said, "The suburbs were scarier than any horror movie." His imagination was his escape, but it was also his prison. Depp's story wasn't so different. The youngest of four in a family that never stayed long in one place. He spent his teenage years playing guitar in smoky bars, searching for something or someone to make him feel less invisible. Acting came by accident, but it offered the same drug, transformation. Each role was a new skin, a new chance to bury the one that hurt. When these two men met, it was less a meeting than a recognition, a flash of self-awareness between strangers who realized they were built from the same material, isolation and imagination. From the beginning, their connection was instinctive. Burton spoke in sketches, fragments, half sentences. Depp understood without explanation. He embodied Tim's sadness the way others memorize lines. Their bond was unspoken, almost telepathic. And perhaps that was its danger. It left no room for distance, for breathing. Art, for them, was not therapy. It was survival. In Edward Scissorhands, Burton sculpted a boy who hurt everything he touched, and Depp played him with a tenderness that felt like autobiography. Both were telling the same story, of being misunderstood, of wanting love but fearing its weight. The success of the film turned that pain into poetry. But the applause only deepened the illusion that suffering could be beautiful, that loneliness could be redeemed through art. Over time, that illusion hardened into ritual. Every few years, they returned to each other like pilgrims. Burton would call, his voice hesitant but expectant, "Johnny, I've got another one." Depp would say yes before hearing the script. It wasn't loyalty, it was necessity. They had become each other's language. But even languages can become cages. As their fame grew, so did their shadows. Burton became the patron saint of the misfit, Depp, its restless prophet. But beneath the surface, exhaustion crept in. The industry expected them to be strange, to deliver eccentricity on command. And so, the very qualities that had set them free began to trap them. The hidden truth of their partnership was that it demanded vulnerability, the kind that few can sustain forever. Burton poured his fears into Depp. Depp absorbed them and turned them into performance. But the exchange was never equal. For one man, it was expression. For the other, exposure. On set, Depp's eyes often betrayed what the characters couldn't say. In Sweeney Todd, they burned with a quiet grief not only for the fictional barber who lost everything, but for the actor who could no longer tell where his pain ended and his role began. In Alice in Wonderland, his Mad Hatter smiled through cracked lips, his laughter trembling like a broken string. Even Burton admitted, there's always something sad in Johnny's eyes, even when he's being funny. That sadness became their shared language. But sadness, when recycled too often, corrodes. It stops being art and starts being habit. By the 2010 seconds, both men were unraveling in different ways. Depp's public image grew turbulent legal battles, headlines, caricatures. Burton, weary of the circus, withdrew from the spotlight. The two who had once built worlds together now seemed trapped in their own. Still, when asked about each other, their answers were always the same: gentle, loyal, evasive, as if protecting not just a friend, but a mirror they couldn't bear to shatter. People assumed their silence meant distance, but silence, for them, had always been intimacy. Some friendships are sustained by laughter. Theirs was sustained by quiet understanding, by the certainty that somewhere, out there, the other existed, carrying the same weight. In that silence lies the most fragile truth of all. They weren't addicted to collaboration. They were addicted to recognition. Tim Burton, the man who built monsters, saw in Johnny Depp a human face for his inner ghosts. Johnny Depp, the man who hid behind faces, found in Tim Burton the only gaze that truly saw him. Theirs was not a friendship of light, but of reflection, and reflection, by nature, doubles everything: joy and grief, creation and decay. Perhaps that's why their films always carried a strange tenderness inside their darkness. Beneath the macabre humor and the gothic excess, there was love, not romantic, but redemptive. A love that said, "You're not alone in your strangeness." And yet, love born in darkness has its cost. Over time, the reflection began to distort. Burton's art grew quieter, more detached, as if afraid of repeating himself. Depp's performances, meanwhile, became louder, almost desperate, as if trying to fill a void that no longer had an audience. They had spent so long creating monsters together that they no longer knew how to exist without them. There's a kind of melancholy in creative symbiosis, the awareness that what makes you powerful also consumes you. Burton and Depp had conjured entire worlds out of sadness. But those worlds, like mirrors, reflected their solitude back at them. When Burton said, "He's my reflection," he was not romanticizing. He was admitting that he had projected too much, that he had hidden too deeply inside the faces of his characters and the performances of another man. And Depp, in turn, had carried that burden willingly, until it became indistinguishable from his own. They didn't destroy each other. They simply blurred. In the end, the real tragedy wasn't that they drifted apart, but that their closeness left no space for healing. Because when two mirrors face each other, the reflection never ends. It only multiplies into infinity, until both vanish into the dark. Their friendship was never about comfort. It was about recognition, the quiet relief of knowing someone else shares your demons. And maybe that's why audiences, even after all these years, still feel something haunting in their films. Beneath the layers of fantasy and stylization lies a universal ache, the yearning to be seen, even if only by another wounded soul. Burton and Depp built a cinematic cathedral for the broken, the strange, the misunderstood. But the foundation of that beauty was pain, and that pain, for all its poetry, never truly left them. They didn't just create monsters. They became them, gently, beautifully, inevitably. When the interviewer asked Tim Burton in 2024 why he hadn't worked with Johnny Depp for over a decade, the room went still. He looked down, tracing invisible shapes on the table with his finger, a nervous habit from his childhood. Then he smiled, faintly, the kind of smile that hides more than it reveals. "I think," he said softly, "we saw too much of ourselves in each other." The words hung in the air, heavier than any silence. It wasn't bitterness, it was weariness. For the first time, Burton spoke not as the eccentric genius or the loyal friend, but as a man realizing that even mirrors can wound. That was the revelation. Not betrayal, not scandal, but recognition, the quiet understanding that their bond, once sacred, had begun to consume them both. He went on to describe the invisible thread that tied them for years. When I worked with Johnny, I didn't have to explain anything. He knew. He understood the pain behind the monsters, the beauty behind the fear. But after a while, it felt dangerous. Because when you look into someone's eyes and see everything you hate and love about yourself, it's terrifying. It was the first time Head admitted what so many had sensed, that their creative intimacy, while extraordinary, had become a form of emotional dependence. They were each other's oxygen and their suffocation. For years, their connection had been their sanctuary, a safe space to hide from Hollywood's emptiness. But the cost of that safety was self-erasure. Tim hid behind Johnny's performances. Johnny hid behind Tim's imagination. Together, they blurred until neither could tell where one ended and the other began. When the partnership paused, it wasn't a rupture. It was a retreat, an instinct for survival. Burton retreated into solitude, painting and drawing again. Depp, caught in personal storms, drifted through roles that no longer felt anchored to meaning. Both, in their own way, were detoxing from each other. And yet, the bond never truly broke. In every interview, in every reference, there lingered an unspoken tenderness, an ache that refused to fade. When Depp was asked about Burton, he simply said, "He's family." You don't stop loving family, you just learn to love them from far away. That sentence echoed Burton's own philosophy. Some connections aren't meant to be fixed, only to be understood. Their revelation wasn't tragic. It was human. For the first time, both men stopped performing the roles the world had written for them, the eccentric director and the misunderstood muse. Instead, they stood as two aging artists, fragile and aware, acknowledging that what once gave them life now demanded space to breathe. In that honesty lay the real shock that behind decades of gothic fantasy and cinematic monsters, the most haunting truth was beautifully simple. Love, even platonic and artistic, has its limits. Because when one becomes the mirror of the other, neither can grow. Burton's films after their separation grew quieter, more introspective. Depp's choices, though erratic, revealed a man searching for authenticity beyond performance. The distance became a form of healing, a way to rediscover where one soul ended and the other began. Still, their shadow partnership remains one of cinema's most mysterious love stories, not romantic, but deeply spiritual. It was never about gender, fame, or even art. It was about survival, two men clinging to each other's reflection to remind themselves they were still real. And in that revelation lies the paradox of all creative intimacy, to know someone so deeply that you risk losing yourself. Burton's final words in that interview could have been written for every misfit who ever found solace in another. Sometimes, the people who understand your darkness the most are the ones you must learn to let go of, not because the love is gone, but because it's too complete. There was no anger in his tone, no sadness either. Only acceptance, that quiet grace that follows a long storm. The friendship that once created monsters had turned into something else, a memory that still breathes, a shadow that still moves when the light changes. And perhaps that is the most haunting beauty of all. That even when the mirror cracks, the reflection remains. In the end, the story of Tim Burton and Johnny Depp is not a tale of downfall, but of reflection, two souls who met in the dark and taught the world that monsters can be tender. Their friendship was never built on light, it was built on recognition. Each saw in the other what no one else could bear, to look at the loneliness beneath genius, the fear beneath creation. Together, they transformed pain into art and made millions feel less alone in their strangeness. But the truest art, like the truest love, demands distance. Because without distance, there is no perspective, only echo. And for years, they had lived inside that echo, repeating each other's sadness until it became song. When Burton called Depp his reflection, he wasn't romanticizing the past. He was acknowledging its cost, the slow erosion of self that happens when two wounded people mistake survival for salvation. Their revelation wasn't about scandal or separation, it was about learning that even kindred spirits must sometimes walk apart to remain whole. Yet, what they created endures a cinematic legacy of melancholy and magic. Edward Scissorhands, Sweeney Todd, Sleepy Hollow, these are not just films, they are confessions carved into celluloid. They remind us that art is born not from perfection, but from fracture. Burton once said, "I love things that don't fit." And perhaps that is the moral of their story, that imperfection in art, in friendship, in love is where beauty hides. Depp and Burton showed us that even in darkness, connection is possible, that two outsiders can build an empire of empathy from the ruins of their pain. But they also taught us something quieter, more human, that to truly love another soul, even as a friend, even as a muse, you must let them exist beyond your reflection. Because no matter how exquisite the mirror, it can never replace the person inside it. And so, their story ends not with goodbye, but with a lingering silhouette, two figures walking in opposite directions, yet forever lit by the same flickering light. They did not escape their monsters. They simply learned to live beside them and, in doing so, taught us how to love ours.